If you're not in Nairobi, you're in Mombasa, in Kisumu, in Kakamega, and other towns, the dates are available on standard of nairobimarathon.com. Just go to www.nairobimarathon.com, register there with only 2,000 bob, and start preparing yourself for that run. Or if you're anywhere else in the world, the Nairobi Marathon actually also has a virtual run. So register today for it. It's August 7th, and we talk about the forgotten victims of the attack. That's a headline today in The Nation. The Standard today has a headline on bomb blast babies speaking 25 years on. 25 years ago, on such a day in 1998, there was an attack in Nairobi that basically shook the country and the region. There was a simultaneous attack as well in Dar es Salaam. Shook the entire region. And since then, we have seen terror in our shores, and we have witnessed terror more than once. Let's discuss that now. Our guest, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, is the director at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Harry, good morning.
Good morning to you.
Good to have you in the Situation Room again. First time this year.
Yeah, that's correct.
Taking you 8 months to get back here.
Well, I don't know who is to blame for that.
Plus.
I'm always available.
Really?
Yes.
We are also always available. This show is always live, 6 to 10 a.m. every weekday morning.
Yes.
But it's good to have you.
Yeah, but I'm a big fan.
Karibu sana. Karibu
Yes,
sana.
certainly.
City is away, so I have the day's proverb, and today's proverb is from this region, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. What's common about them? Mali, Niger, Burkina. Okay.
Yes.
The other thing that's also common is that there's an ethnic group that is found in all these countries.
Fulani.
Yeah. And they have a proverb. Those people of the Songhai Empire. Confidence is like the cooked head of a sheep. If the head is cooked well, a person will eat it. Confidence is like the cooked head of a sheep. If the head is cooked well, a person will eat it. What do you mean? What do you think?
I think that is what we call philosophic sagacity. It's very wise words. If anything is presented well, no matter how ugly it may be in its makeup, it's going to be consumed.
So how confident you appear to be is how people will take you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Even if you really know a lot and you don't present yourself with confidence, people will be like, all right, do we really know whether... And if you come with a lot of confidence and you come with an orb and tell people, look into this thing, they will look into it. And you'll give them 7,000 bob. And they will go.
You had to.
Had to.
You know,
Had to.
as they say, people buy you before they buy your product.
Indeed.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good direct interpretation of it. Dr. Kanenje, tell us about the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. What do you do there? There's very many things. Horn, international.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, now, we are a research and policy think tank that focuses on, among other issues of defense and security, diplomacy, foreign relations, terrorism, violent extremism, as well as climate security. And we focus primarily on the Great Horn of Africa, 13 countries of the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa, as well as Central. But mostly our analysis and also research extends from the Cape to Cairo. Yes, and so we cover largely the continent. And by extension, in terms of the work we do, we also extend some of the analysis and work to the Global South. But largely, the primary center is the Greater Horn. The secondary is the continent, as well as in the rest of the world.
Okay.
Yes.
Want to talk about what we are discussing today, which is as we commemorate the August 7th bomb blast memorial and what the country has then witnessed in the last 25 years, issues of security and terrorism. We've had serious spikes and what we, the public, assume to be lulls, and then some what we see and assume to be spikes in acts of terrorism. How's the situation been like? Let's say just in the last 5 years.
First of all, 2 hours from now, in 1998, Kenya suffered probably the largest attack on its soil that claimed the lives of more than 200, innocent civilians. as well as more than 4,000 who were injured. And I think before we proceed, we just like to pay tribute to those who are still living with the wounds, still nursing the scars of that. I think sometimes that is forgotten. You know, there are children who lost their parents. Half of Kenya was not alive then. Now we think almost twice the population that we were at the time. Nonetheless, I think there's still a lot of pain, especially in the light that we still have this problem that is still going on despite our efforts, our best efforts to contain it. In the last 5 years, of course, we have seen something that, while it has increased in terms of attempts to attack the country, I think the efforts to contain them have also been a lot more robust. There are a lot of lessons have been learned from the previous experiences, in part because of, as a frontier country, in a very terror-prone region, considering the presence of Al-Shabaab in Somalia. I think there's plenty that the country has made in terms of progress, but there's still a long way to go, in part because just of the multiplicity of such threats that are emanating not just even from Somalia, but right now they have spread all across from Cabo Delgado to eastern DRC.
Have we seen that the structure of terror and its activities has changed in any way? Obviously, we are seeing from 1998 until today different kinds of terror, with the digital space opening up. There's been a lot more that then has been introduced to our minds in terms of what can be a terrorizing situation, and folks who are ready to put their dollars behind that to make sure that it happens. But how would you say that the structure of terror has changed, if any way, over those last few years?
Our initial, I think, conception that was in part sparked by the 1998 bombing, which was not the first. It was, against Kenya, was actually the second after 1981 Norfolk. But this was the biggest, but also the most organized. There was a central command, and we were attacked by the world's largest terror group at the time, which was Al-Qaeda. And many activities were organized and arranged and directed by the central command, with resources as well as manpower to do that. Even the ideology was also controlled, but that has changed. Right now, we're having franchises, but also a proliferation of such groups that are not exactly affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but they're equally harmful, if not worse. And so, to the extent that both the platforms which they either recruit or spread messages have evolved because of the information superhighway, like today, as you rightly mentioned, the internet has become the new frontier of recruitment. A lot of young Kenyan youth, both men and women, have fallen victim of this and have been recruited, and they're doing it, very effectively. You see, the more I think the terrorist organizations and VE groups have been beaten, especially in traditional spaces, they've assumed new spaces where they think they may have a comparative advantage. And so many governments have been trying to play catch up all the time because the enemy is also very smart and very resilient.
Okay. Professor, as we talk about the dynamic structure of terror, I am thinking about the aggressive campaigns that obviously the world at large has come up with to counter VE and the likes. But from that particular space, in terms of the aggression and the campaigns and the rallying efforts towards ensuring that terrorism is countered, we have also propped up a space for possibly one of the most vile human rights violations. And I'll give you an example of extrajudicial execution as well as enforced disappearance. I'm speaking about this as IMLU, the Independent Medical Legal Unit that works around prevention and response of torture and related violations. And my question to you then is, even as we look at countering this particular, animal in various areas, do we then prioritize, countering any other side effects that may come? Do we even have data to show that this campaign had this effect on people who are not supposed to be part of this particular campaign? Do we have maybe an analysis to say, hey, could we restructure this particular campaign? Because now we have 36 persons, forcibly disappeared as a result of, because I know that there has been money. For instance, I think in 2016, we had Kenya receiving about $120 million, right? Mm-hmm. The military to counter VE. And I think the police received around 8 million Kenya shillings. But do we then, have enough empirical evidence or data to show that we did this, but there was this also on the other side? Because there are people listening and hoping that at least they would hear about some of their forcibly disappeared people. We're looking as far back as 2014.
There's always a very delicate balance between national security and human rights,
right,
and people's freedoms and liberties. The world over. It is there in the United States. It's been there, across the continent and other parts of the world. Now, the initial focus, I think, by many governments was the use of hard power. And hard power, of course, then ran counter to lots of constitutional provisions of many countries. And so what we have seen increasingly, and what partly led to the formation of the National Strategy on Countering Extremism in Kenya, for instance, 2016, was the adoption of a whole-of-society approach, more softer approaches in countering actually the problem. Because let's be honest, the world had tried to shoot its way out of terrorism. Of course, it did not work. And if we just go using some of the achievements that the national strategy, that's the Kenya National Strategy on Countering Extremism, has achieved, it's been tremendous. In some places right now, like Isiolo, we've been having 0 cases of EE as a result of that. Yes. And so I think the whole of society approach that the Kenyan government adopted was also in recognition of the failure, for instance, of hard approaches, or at least the limitations of hard approaches, or over-reliance on hard approaches in countering the problem. But the recognition that the entire community needs to be involved, because security starts with each and every one of us, I think has been a game changer. Of course, there is a lot more to be done, in the future, and there's still a lot more, to be able to address. But to the extent that improvement has been made, I think cannot be ignored.
Cannot be ignored. What does the face of surveillance look like? I mean, we've had conversations about this before when we talk about, terrorism became a thing whereby you try to be a step ahead. And unfortunately, when you cut off one head, another one, maybe 3 or 4, then pop up to recover that one. So what does the face of surveillance look like? Just aiding in some of the things you've just mentioned, parts where you would previously expect that there would be terror activity, whether it was in recruitment, whether it was, the fundamental extremism that you saw before. How has surveillance improved, whereby now you can say, we can keep an eye on this, we hear the chatter, we know what the conversations are, we know what the plans are. Has that improved over years?
Yeah, most certainly. Terrorism and terror ideology, it's like water. They're always going to look for the lowest place and whatever opening to be able to pass through. So if you're going to close one hole, it's going to find another hole, probably that you're not aware of. And so governments, what they've been doing, and even the Kenyan government itself, is how can we be able to expand this beyond, for instance, mere inspections? And so what we have seen around the world is governments are coordinating very closely, whether it comes to terror financing, whether it comes to immigration, whether it comes to communication, using the Silicon Valley, to ensure that most of the content, for instance, intercepted, and some of the content that can be used for recruitment, it's not even seen out there. That is why many of you nowadays, you don't see a lot of videos of Al-Shabab perhaps conducting certain things. You don't see them. There's a reason why that's being done. That is used to blunt the ability of these groups to actually both recruit as well as coordinate and organize. But of course, terror groups are always going to try and find a loophole, because they're a lot more determined a lot of times than an average citizen.
I want to look at the reasons why. I believe I read something you wrote once, and you said sometimes the reasons are inexplicable. But are we seeing that there's a different reason why now folks would get into this? Money being one of them, a big one. That the recruitment of terrorists is easy, quote unquote, because the offering to them is something that they've never seen before. religious fundamentalism as well comes into play. Are we seeing the reasons behind engagement in terrorism also with these things that we've seen change? Surveillance has improved. We've seen now that governments and their terror financing has also improved. It's become a lot more engaging. Have we seen the reasons why people go into terrorism also then now altered over years? Or do they remain the same?
Actually, I think the interesting thing, what you just mentioned about money being a big factor in these groups joining terror groups, actually it's not. No. And you just want to give an example. 15 out of 19 terror hijackers in the 9/11, the United States, were Saudi. They had training in aviation schools. They could fly jumbo jets. They could have gotten any job, around the world. So that certainly was not, the key factor.
Okay.
Some of the masterminds of terror attacks in Kenya were university graduates from law, from engineering. These are people who had a future. However, there is sometimes something greater apart from just the money, because the money can only take you so far. And that has to do with the manner in which the ideology is propagated. And one of the things we've realized, from our study is in Kenya, for instance, a lot of young people who joined Al-Shabab groups also seem to come from broken families.
Okay.
Yes. And so it has also something to do with parenting and the need to belong and the desire to be relevant. But secondly, you have terrorist groups providing very easy answers to very complex problems.
Such as?
You see, governments or parents, sometimes you're going to be at pains to explain to your child why they're in such predicament. But terror groups have
ready answer,
and they have a clear solution to that. And so, because they provide easy answers and easy solutions, that if you get rid of this, then you're going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it makes sense. But I think of focusing so much on the fact that is money. Sometimes we miss the point. There are certain cases where people have been driven by money to try and join. But you see, what will be
so the motivation is not to get money.
It's not always to get money.
But the vulnerability is because of the poverty creates a new level of vulnerability.
The poverty creates a grievance.
So can I ask, based on what you've been able to see, and as you analyze this, then, if you took two individuals, one person, well-to-do, essentially, is like you say, a graduate, has done 1, 2, 3. They're not for want of daily bread. The other, the opposite, for want of daily bread, comes from a broken home, does not know where the next meal is going to come from. Who would be the easier one to recruit?
Poverty is a predisposing factor. It's not a causal factor.
Okay.
Two, if one person comes from a wealthy family, but is surrounded by circumstances that speak to their heart, then they're still going to go, because number one, they also have the means to actually be able to transport themselves across the board. That is why some children, including children of senior politicians in this country, have been caught trying to cross over to Somalia. You see, on the continent, we've always been poor for much of our existence, where we've not always been terrorists, have we?
No.
And there are countries which are worse off than us. But not necessarily. People from Pokot, they're not, joining terror groups en masse. Why is that? Not to say that Pokots are poor, but generally some of these areas are marginalized, that have increased lots of vulnerability for these people. That really can make them susceptible to terror recruitment. So, poverty and underdevelopment is a predisposing factor, but it's not a causal factor.
Okay.
Security systems have been financed, resourced, organized to detect terror, right? Globally. If you look at whichever country, even in our own country, we have various security organs that are basically just looking at this and being able to detect terror. NIS, military intelligence, the DCI, anti-terror police unit. We also now have the overall coordinating agency, the National Counterterrorism Center, and all this. But it's still possible for terrorism to take place and terrorists to come in, to deploy, to recruit, to do all these things. Why is this breakdown? If you look at that entire value chain of terrorism, like you said, starts with somebody with an ideology and is able to convince someone. Then there's somebody who is funding and financing, and they're able to actually move big amounts of money. And these big amounts of money are able to buy arms. There is arms trading and transportation coming into these areas. Where they are, the recruiters, they're able to send people into communities and find those who are vulnerable, and they recruit them and they bring them in and they train them. How come security systems are not able to detect them from the very beginning at that big point of financing or transportation of arms?
Part of it has to do with generally the societal makeup. Number one, as society, there's certain sometimes deficiencies that we have. You see, if let's say you are a public officer or you are a community leader, and you've been told there is someone who is trying to cross over the border, has a consignment you don't understand, and somehow with 5,000 shillings you let them pass, they come and you give them, as a village person, you decide, or even a chief, that, well, you can still stay in my neighborhood because you gave me 1,000 shillings. You don't really pay attention to that. Those are kind of things that create loopholes. And so, also as society and as Kenyans, you see, it is easy to point fingers, at somebody else. But do we raise alarm when we actually see something that is different? Do we raise alarm when we see things that are not right? Do we even raise alarm when we see people being corrupt? We don't. Secondly, we have another bigger problem, and that is the regional dynamics. Kenya is not an island, unfortunately. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. And we live in a neighborhood that is very fragile, that is prone with terror groups, especially our neighboring Somalia, still struggling with and being an epicenter of Al-Shabaab. We share a very long border with Somalia, for instance. We cannot close every loophole when it comes to that. And so instability in Somalia is always going to mean some kind of instability in Kenya.
Yeah.
These are kinds of tied at the hip. Now we have seen the Al-Shabaab making inroads into Ethiopia, that for a long time it appeared to be impregnable. In Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, just a few years ago, it wasn't a problem. In Eastern DRC, 2 months ago, there was a Kenyan who actually attacked a church. The Kenyan was from Misli. So it tells you that we also have must have a regional approach, to this problem, because since we're not an island and we cannot close all our borders at every point, we're going to have to look at it holistically, both from the regional perspective as well as Kenyans, as Kenyan citizens. What do we really care about?
But see, my concern really is, look at Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab is painted as this ragtag militia, it is organized, their leaders have been killed, there are others who are trying to come up, there's always infighting within Al-Shabaab, but Al-Shabaab is able to still mobilize. Al-Shabaab is able to acquire the resources that it needs, it's able to get the weaponry that it wants to use. Despite having a Kenyan military force, a Ugandan military force, and other military forces in Somalia who are looking for the Al-Shabaab, despite them having the support of Americans and their drones and their super power, looking at this ragtag militia, why are we unable to extinguish this rat?
You see, when you're fighting conventional war with an unconventional opponent, it's always going to be a struggle. If Al-Shabaab was organized the way armies are organized, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. But they know that is not where their strength lies. And so they're going to always conduct insurgency campaigns. Now, it is true that the Kenyan contingent is part of ATMIS. So it only exists there. It does not have a separate mission outside ATMIS. And right now it's actually supporting only, or rather playing a supporting role as ATMIS, because they transition from AMISON to ATMIS. So it's a lot more limited. It's supposed to offer technical expertise and assistance to the Somali government or Somali forces. But it's still thin. If you compare some of the missions deployed elsewhere, you're going to realize it's not that big, actually. And now, to the extent that the problem still continues, of course, can raise questions among citizens in both countries, as why is our presence there for, and how come we're not getting the desired results? I can tell you this: you want to see Talibanization of Somalia? Just pull out and just say we are not going to support Somalia again, and so let's just abandon this mission. We have seen the United States had almost 200,000 troops, NATO, in Afghanistan. What happened? Who is in power today? It's the Taliban. And so this is not a war that can be defined by a few successes, but to the extent that they no longer have a presence in Kismayo, where the Kenyan contingent had been operating, to the extent that they're no longer able to collect the kind of taxes they used to. We've starved them of a lot of things. But do you remember, these are also connected to certain community movements, and they're connected to other international terror organizations. That's what builds resilience. But the unity of those who are fighting them, it is the strength.
Let's take a break. At 27 minutes to 9, Kenya's biggest conversation is hosting Dr. Hassan Kanenje. He's the director, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, on this day as we commemorate the August 7th bomb blast memorial. 25 years ago, many Kenyans died, many others were injured, many survived with injuries as Kenya witnessed its biggest terror attack. We are looking at Kenya's battle with terrorism over the years, and that's why he's here. bomayangu.go.ke, the government's affordable housing platform, is where you need to go to register so that you can participate in ownership of a home. Go and you'll see the very many projects that are listed on that website. And you can also register by using your USSD code *832#. That's *832#.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Are you a content creator? Here is how you will make money from your content. Calling all artists and actors. StarDigit is the platform to package your content for public consumption, market it, and put money in your pocket. How are we different? We offer distribution and data services with amazing benefits that include real-time detailed sales reports so you can see how much money you've made at any time. TV, radio, and newspaper advertisements and interviews to push your content and grow your brand. How does it work? Your content will be purchased through simple mobile channels that will bill via M-Pesa straight to your fans' mobile phones and gadgets. Call us for more information on 0706 300 850 or email kminer2@standardmedia.co.ke.
Get a good buyer, one that is interested in paperwork, traceability, impact. They will ask you a lot more paperwork, and that's why you need to be compliant.
Interesting. So compliance is a key thing.
Number one.
Why is it that the world is looking at Africa? And probably maybe why don't Africans see what we have?
Number one, Africa is the continent of the present. Let's stop with this nonsense of Africa being the continent of the future. Arid lands are immense.
True. And there's so much, yeah.
We believe there is a lot of value in arid land. My tip for who's unemployed is stay active as if you're working. Wake up early. Don't idle. That's the worst thing you can do, because it's a moment that you just become idle, and look, things like depression, anxiety, they're real.
At Stima Sacco, we are a reflection of you. We are a stable, financially sound institution providing tailor-made services to add value to your life, time, and money. We are guided by your aspiration. We are designed to match your ambition. We are Stima Sacco, a true reflection of you.
Is it going to be a world record? Yes, it is! She smashed it!
Ferdinand Omanyala ignites this stadium.
This is the first strike in the playoff series decider. It comes in the form of Kenya's captain.
Starlets wanapata bao.
And he got it again!
Relieve every
moment on the grandstand.
Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
Top of the hour. Conversation continues with Dr. Hassan Kanenje as we commemorate the August 7th memorial.
Professor, I'm wondering, because you've had lots of studies done and you have the reasons addressed as you have already, has corruption been one of those, say, top 5? Because there had been allegations at some point, between 2014 and 2016, that indeed corruption is what kept, this particular campaign ongoing on the other side in Somalia. We had issues of, the politicians selling charcoal, the politicians selling sugar. So when you're doing these particular studies and you have an inkling of some of these things that are being said, are those reasons you consider or maybe question or look into, or do we just say, okay, this is not part of our study, we're going to let it go? And if indeed you did, please tell us what it looked like when you went in. Was that something that was a real thing that kept this particular campaign going? And if indeed it was, how much did we lose?
Yes. Thanks a lot for that question. Those are allegations we've actually had about the Kenyan personnel being involved in charcoal selling, and that's the reason we maintain our presence in Somalia and Kismayu. I think that's equivalent of using a Rolls Royce to go and buy a bicycle. It doesn't exactly make sense. You see, what the country has spent in terms of blood and treasure is astronomical, is nothing compared to whatever thing that could ever have come out of it. And those stories, most of them are actually flatly false. Now, I think one of the things we also need to understand, it is Kenya's deployment and presence, contribution to AMISOM also was politicized by especially Somali politicians, quite a bit. And so they profited extensively, of course, by painting the Kenyan contingent selling charcoal. Really, how much money can you get from charcoal?
I imagine.
Exactly, as in it doesn't exactly make sense. Yeah, so that is neither here nor there.
Well, from the photos we saw, guy, come on. You can make a pretty penny. If the photos we saw are real, at the port of Kismayu, and piles upon piles of bags of charcoal, that's a lot of money.
That's
for an individual. You're not talking about the government.
Now, and unfortunately, we didn't go there as individuals, we went there as government. And so the decision has to be made by government, and government was spending a lot of money in body, in treasure, and in souls. And it is not exactly worth it. And I would like to challenge anybody who is watching to actually go and do the math. Even right now, of the charcoal export from Kismayo, how much money comes in? And how much money was actually Kenya, spending,
You see, why I asked this question, Prof, is there are women in the villages who lost their sons on the other side. And what was being said was because of charcoal. I lost my breadwinner because of charcoal. And when it's said in Swahili, it's even more painful. Nimepoteza mtoto kwa sababu ya makaa. So when we have this particular discussion, it's very nice to also shape that particular narrative that this is what it looked like, because it's very fashionable and trendy, but this is not what was on the ground, that we had so many other things that influenced this particular campaign and had it going for this, time period. Because if that's what people think about when it comes to, deployment and the amounts that we spend, then it truly just doesn't make sense.
I'm not a government spokesperson.
Right.
And so I'm not holding for government. So I'm speaking a very, very independent, perspective. There were allegations, about that. Why did Kenya get into Somalia, to start with? Kenya got into Somalia in part because Al-Shabab was raiding our territory and kidnapping tourists. Tourism is a critical sector in Kenya's economy. It was literally destroying our economy.
Right.
So it was a national interest. It still remains a national interest issue. It's going to be that way for whoever president or leader is going to be for this country in the years to come.
Right.
And so for us to actually simplify that to charcoal, it is kind of it's kind of a little bit oxymoronic. Now, I feel for those mothers, those fathers who've lost their children or who've lost their family members as a result of the conflict. But a lot of it had to do with the conflict itself as opposed to actually charcoal. The Kenyan contingent, if they were to pull out of ATMIS, you're still going to have those issues inside Somalia. It is important to understand that even as much as ATMIS or AMISOM have supported the Somali government in beating back Al-Shabaab and getting territory, Al-Shabaab still is present in lots of the hinterland of Somalia. And they still going to start wreaking havoc. Look, just a few years ago, they were still, even last year, they were collecting taxes for next year. Al-Shabaab. Because they've already collected for this year, but they don't have money. So they're still going to wreak havoc on you. So for us to look at it from just the prism of some maybe corrupt individual, honestly, it is minimizing the sacrifices that a lot of people have made, and the men and women who've paid the ultimate sacrifice to protect this country and save the region.
Those who have analytical discussions and are keeping the conversation alive in terms of, what should be done or what is being done, the suggestion has come that acts of terror should not be publicized, that the aftermath of terror should not be publicized. We've seen countries like the United States be very good at that. The threat to the United States, well, according to the Wilson Center, is that there are multiple terror attacks in the US. I don't know how many there have been this year, but they never make this information public, and they feel that this is making progress on the fight against terror, because what you do is that when you make it public, you feed that particular monster. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, terror thrives on publicity. That is their fuel. When they get publicized, of course, it inspires others. It communicates their relevance. It instills fear. Remember, it's supposed to terrorize. And you can't be terrorized with what you don't know, what you haven't seen, what you haven't heard about. You're going to be terrorized with what you have seen, heard, or at least been told. And so to the extent that, for instance, Western countries, the United States, try as much to suppress that kind of information, of course it's helpful. Now, one of the things that, of course, we also need to train ourselves, both as citizens as well as, since now every citizen has a phone and can be able to post anything, is to try and deny them that space, because that is what they're seeking. Because remember, they're not working for you. No matter what grievance you may have against government, for instance, government's primary responsibility is to protect their own citizens. The terrorists, they don't have that responsibility. Actually, their goal is to make sure they disorganize government.
So essentially what you're saying is that on this side of the pond, usually you're going to whip out the first gadget that you have to start taking pictures or take videos. Media obviously prone to want to cover an event when it happens and then cover the aftermath of it. And what you're saying is starve them of this particular joy.
You have to starve them of this particular joy and to kind of learn some of the art of self-censoring so that you know what information. Let's even just take from a humanitarian perspective. What if you take that picture and it turns out it's my sister and I see the horrific way in which she was murdered? It's going to traumatize me for my entire life. Fine, you will say I was the first to put it out there, but what was the impact? That is why a lot of advanced countries do not actually share these images. They don't want to do that. They want to minimize, because why would you have to give them free media when anyone else, if they needed media, they can have to pay for it, but they're getting it for free?
Well, I agree in terms of showing the gruesome nature of how a terrorist act is carried out. But in terms of covering terrorism and acknowledging that this has happened, I think if you don't, then you're also minimizing the value of the lives lost. For example, we know that very many security officers have died in this country. Now, for as long as we don't actually talk about those that have died, bodies are taken to their families bury their loved ones, and we seem to want to basically keep that completely low and minimized. We are not acknowledging the sacrifice of that soldier. Is that not so? And we see this a lot. I mean, do we ever get reports of how many of security agencies, those that are taking part in the Somalia operation, any that died? Do we ever have any commemoration of those that as our fallen soldiers? The police officers who are being blown off left, right, and center in these parts within the country, do we actually recognize them and acknowledge them?
I think information is actually out there. I think part of the challenge, especially, let's say, between the fourth estate and government, is fourth estate building a relationship where they can be able to get certain information from the government in a way that is also responsible. Because, for instance, families need to know about the passing of their loved ones before it's reported in the media. You see, and so we also need to be trained on knowing how to do this so that we actually can be able to get it responsibly. But I think because of the chasm that is existing between the fourth estate sometimes and the government, then that link, misses. But information is actually always out there. Now, it is true that we should not minimize the lives of those ones lost. Non-admission of fact does not negate its factuality. And so if it's a fact that someone has passed and someone had served this country honorably and they paid the ultimate sacrifice, that person should celebrate it and also remembered. So that even on a day like this, they're among the people we actually remember for the sacrifice they've paid to defend us and to keep us safe. And so I think one thing that needs to be done is a lot more effort need to be done to ensure there is a seamless working relationship between, for instance, those with the source of information and those who are supposed to also communicate to the public in public interest.
Prof, you've mentioned something that I'd like for us to unpack. You're talking about training of journalists in terms of how it is that they report. So in essence, you're saying that there are certain recommendations that you as an institution may have for particular security players, yeah? Then my question to you would be, have you at least partnered with any civil society organizations, for instance, the Independent Medical Legal Unit that works around maybe victims of torture, especially under the ATPU and stuff like that? Do you have any recommendations, just like you've given the journalists? And do you actually have any ongoing partnerships, either in Kenya or outside? And if you have, what has worked and who would you like to partner with, especially in Kenya? Because we are very interested in discussions such as this ones. And I'm asking especially because I know there would be strategic interventions that we can partner around. Yeah.
I think the right person, entity to partner with will have to be a government institution, the security, the internal security as well as defense. They have all the information that is going to be required to do that. Now, with us, we're always, available to be able to add value, to whatever interaction, that can be able to advance the interest, especially the safety and security of the country as well as the region,
So for purposes of clarity, what I meant was, you have the data, you are speaking of softer issues. So we are looking at outside of the money, we already have a space where someone is already possibly coming from a very not stable home, you have the data. So if this data is available, say for instance, an institution like ours, IMLU, where we offer wholesome rehabilitative services, then we are able to now know this is Lamu, these are the cases that we have here, this is where we can go. So obviously, if you're going to work around security, you'll partner with the state, certainly.
Yes.
But now with the civil society organizations, is your study or maybe are your recommendations readily available to persons like us?
Yeah, most certainly. We work very closely with other civil society organizations as think tanks. And so we have MOUs with many,
you do?
Of course. And so we're always open to engaging, anyone who is willing. Because we're in the business of creating ideas, but also providing solutions.
Great. That's nice to know. We'll follow up on that one.
The National Counter-Terrorism Center. Not many people know about it. I'm sure you do. What is it?
Is the agency that is tasked with coordinating PCVE efforts.
What is that?
Preventing and countering violent extremism efforts. And it was established with the purpose of ensuring that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, that all the efforts that are geared towards countering violent extremism as well as terrorism are actually harmonized. Because what had happened before is the haphazard nature in which, of course, we approached the problem because we were unprepared. Remember, when we got first attacked, we were not the primary target. This was a conflict and unfinished business between Al-Qaeda and the West and the USA. You see, and so increasingly, as the problem became homegrown, there was a need and a desire by the government to establish an agency going to coordinate all efforts, both governmental as well as non-governmental, in ensuring that we're speaking from the same mouth and we're not working at cross purposes, because that militated against a smooth approach to the problem and perhaps contributed to some of the issues that my sister here probably has been raising in terms of human rights.
So who sits in it, in the Counterterrorism Center?
A number of agencies within government, both from security sectors across the board, as well as others who may not exactly be dealing with security, but they have a role in security because of like terrorism financing and stuff like that. It is important those efforts are done, but it also involves communities, and it has engaged faith leaders, religious leaders, community leaders. They are part of that, as well as institutions of both lower, middle, and as well as higher learning to ensure that things are harmonized. But generally, it is largely a civilian, organization.
So when you talk about countering violent extremism, this should be the body that's front and center. This should be the body that the public sees engaging with them.
Yes.
Trying to understand what the community is feeling like, what the community is going through, whether there are any vulnerabilities that are emerging, and dealing with those. Right?
Yes. Yeah, this is the face of this one that's dealing with the communities, and it's actually very, very open. A lot of times.
Is this face visible, in your opinion, Prof?
The face is visible, but it's limited, and part of it has to do generally just with I think the fact that there are only too many people to do so much in terms of work, and that is why NCTC tends to rely a lot of more time on the communities to be able to actually also do their work. Just typical as many, of course, government agencies are, you're going to be limited in terms of your scope. But because on recognition of the soft approach, you're not going to be bringing battalions, because that is not, its purpose. It's supposed to coordinate efforts. And so it relies extensively and heavily on communities and other actors in business, in corporate, institutions, to ensure that it actually gets the work done. Because outside that, it is impossible to be able to succeed without involving everybody. And that is why they have a whole of society approach.
Be that as it may, I look at, for example, the war against corruption, all right? Yes. An institution is established called the AntiCorruption Authority. And it's supposed to spearhead this fight. And then there's the other one, the Anti-Corruption Steering Committee, that other thing. But then those are the ones that we ask questions. So how much are you engaging with the people? If you talk about the national campaign against drug abuse, there's NACADA, which is supposed to be the body that is publicly visible in countering alcoholism. Why don't we see anything about the NCTC? I mean, do you even know who the head of NCTC is?
Is it covert or overt? We need to at least get that right.
Exactly.
Because
is it an intelligence unit or is it?
Yeah.
No, interestingly, it is actually not. It is not covert. It's a very, very open, house that you can be able to interact with. They have a number, toll free. Generally, if you go to NCTC website, you're going to find they interact with citizens. Live. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the recognition of the limitations of the hard approaches alone to solve the problem. And that's why increasingly it decided that we're going to adopt soft approaches, because they've been bearing fruit, at least in much of the last 10 years.
Okay. Sure. Not to be a Debbie Downer in any way, but terrorism by nature is going to occur. It's going to occur repeatedly. Do you think nations then, who then are susceptible to these attacks futurely, are well prepared, better prepared in terms of intelligence, in terms of actual mitigating the effects of an attack?
when we were first attacked in a major way in 1998, we can say we were not exactly, sufficiently prepared. Kenya is a country that has always been known to be prepared in receiving tourists, not in receiving terrorists. And so when terrorists came knocking, we were actually not exactly ready.
Yeah.
And that explained some of the haphazard nature in which, of course, we approached it. But I think just based on the history and on of response, we've been able to sufficiently, build a more robust framework that is responding to this. Just going by the recent attack at 14 Riverside Drive, you saw even the number of casualties were way less. Yet, ideally, that would have been a massacre. Or that is not to diminish those ones who died. But I think the thing would have been worse. Now, the fact that right now the agencies that are coordinating to be able to ensure that this thing, the problem is solved, of course, we're a lot more prepared. But let's face it also. You see, we live in a region that is volatile. And so, terror acts may happen and probably will happen again. But it's not whether it will happen, it's how prepared are we
For when it does.
For when it does. Number two, do we as citizens, and I keep pushing this point, do we acknowledge and recognize our role in actually fighting terrorism?
Yeah.
The United States, in part of the reason it tends to be impregnable after 2001 is because people are very, very conscious of the environment situationally. When you pass in a neighborhood that you're new, you're going to be reported by the police. That's why they say, when you see something, say something. Are we doing that?
You should tell them, the human rights people. So the ones they don't want to have a police state and all.
No. You if you can't put me on the line here, especially because you see the way I'm trying to make sure that we finish this particular discussion with a nice partnership. But yes, I hear you, especially around advocacy, so that we say this is a shared responsibility. It's not just going to be the state or the police or whoever, that we have our people with their eyes on the ground and on the lookout, so that if you see any specific, something that's off, if it's in your area and you see a certain fishy, tenant, you're able to raise the alarm. And also to say that if someone raises the alarm and there's nothing to it, then you don't also ostracize them because, this person just loves, talking and bluffing and maybe calling for attention. So those are some of the things, obviously, we are talking about. But I'm happy at least to learn that the scorecard looks nice, right? Because from the outside, it just doesn't look like we're winning. It feels like it keeps getting worse, and we have money that we are receiving, but we're not seeing anything. So having this discussion with you is quite useful, that at least we have moved from what we saw in 1998, or even the funny things that we're seeing between 2011 and 2015.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that these particular discussions will keep covering that. It was nice having you on board for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Nice having you too.
Asante sana, Daktari. And of course, it's good to hear that. Yes, of course, we know that we have people who are really dedicated. Those that are out there on the front line, I'm sure some of them, you come across them in your daily interactions. Just tell them we appreciate them.
Yes, and thanks. I also do appreciate that we can actually get a chance to talk about our national security and our collective safety.
Yes.
Because in the old African saying of Ubuntu, I am because you are because we are, and we should stay like that.
Very good. Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Good morning, 9 a.m.